was a cult, and their leader was a man named Charles Manson, and he had 10 or 15 wives. Manson believed that there was an impending race war, and the murders were committed to shock the world. And they left signs that they hoped were going to implicate the Black Panthers. The 4 victims that were stabbed more than 200 times. There was blood writing on the wall. It was a real horrific crime scene. How did Manson get these young women in under a year to go out and kill complete strangers for no other reason than he told them to, and to have no remorse and to actually laugh about it? Jolly West reported to the CIA in 1955 he had developed the technology to implant false memory in a person and remove true memories using drugs and hypnosis.
We have a lot of evidence that government knew more about this stuff. Manson was almost being tracked by authorities before he killed Tate.
There was MK Ultra research going on at all those places that he was at.
When you're in war, mister. You don't make no change without bloodshed.
Charles Manson and the history of government mind control. I have Tom O'Neill here, and Tom is an incredible journalist and really is kind of a tribute to a bygone era of journalism where he was just going to write a routine article about Charles Manson, and it turned into this 20-year saga where he uncovered a whole plot line in the most famous murders in American history, the Manson murders, that involve CIA brainwashing, government mind control, all sorts of craziness. Yeah. And so we are very excited to be here today. And I want to start just with some basic kind of, setting the table, scaffolding. Tom, what is MK Ultra? A lot of people here might not know that the CIA even had a mind control program.
Yeah, MK Ultra was a brainwashing program that was developed by the CIA end of the 40s into the early 50s. It was originally created as a defensive program because intelligence in the United States learned that the Soviet Union and the Chinese and North Koreans had developed these techniques to brainwash people, to get them to make false confessions. They were using drugs, sensory deprivation, a bunch of different technologies. So the United States wanted to learn how to defend against that, particularly for airmen who got shot down overseas and were captured. What began as a defensive program quickly evolved into an offensive program when they realized how effective it could be. The ultimate goal was to create a programmed assassin, people who could be pretty much hypnotized to go out and kill somebody for no reason in their mind or no recollection of being programmed to do it. They had programs for mass conversion where they would try to control groups of people, thousands of people, using media, other kinds of technology. They wanted to be able to implant information in service people's minds that they could courier to across enemy lines, deliver, bring back, and ultimately what they played with the most was memory. They wanted to be able to control people's memory. They wanted to be able to implant false memories in people without their knowledge, take away true memories using initially sodium pentothal and then LSD and then other drugs that we still don't know about. The program was exposed by a whistleblower in about 1975. It was quite sensational. The CIA had to acknowledge that they did it. It was not just illegal. The CIA, by law, is not allowed to operate on U.S. soil, but also it was horrific because they were using, they were doing human experiments on people without their knowledge or consent. And they began in prisons and jails, and then they started doing it with service people. They even set up what they called safe houses in San Francisco and New York City, where prostitutes would lure Johns into rooms where two-way mirrors would be set up. The prostitutes would administer LSD to them, and then they'd observe behaviors and see what they could do with the Johns while they were under control. So this went on until about 73, 74. Watergate was happening. Richard Helms at that point was running the CIA, and it looked like Nixon was going to leave office. A lot of stuff was going to get discovered, and they had to hide it as fast as they could and as effectively as they could. So Richard Helms ordered all of the files destroyed, and nobody would have known about this program if it wasn't for a guy named John Marks, who was a State Department official who found files, financial files in 74, took it to a congressman, and that began congressional investigations. When I began this book about a murder case, a Charles Manson murder case, I'd never heard of MK Ultra. People here probably know more about it now than I did when I began this. And when I first heard about it, I thought it was a fantasy, that it couldn't have been real, but you can see the congressional record. There were 3 different hearings. The church hearings were the longest, but there was also a congressional combined Ted Kennedy and Daniel Inouye hearings. Testimonies entered into the record. The CIA lied. They said that it hadn't been effective, that they allowed themselves to look like fools, and they said none of this stuff worked. We shouldn't have done it. It was inhumane. Ha, 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 stupid us. We're not going to do it again. Sorry. And Congress let them get away with that. In fact, a lot of it was effective. A lot of it had worked. And I found out a little bit about what they'd done that had never been reported before, that bled into this famous story about Charles Manson and the murders that occurred there. So that's kind of like the 2-minute or 5-minute
Yeah,
intro.
you could go on forever. I mean, it's insane how widespread of a program it was. Like, it was like hundreds, if not thousands, of psychiatrists. You had outposts in Canada, this guy Ewan Cameron doing torturous techniques on people. You had Andrei Puharich, and he had his Roundtable Institute in Maine. He had an outpost in upstate New York where they had these space kids, where they were trying to like communicate with, you know, these otherworldly beings. And actually Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry, like, that was channeled via this woman named Phyllis Schlafly. It's a really crazy kind of counter history. And then you have all the, you know, kind of Manchurian Candidate political stuff a little bit.
And the notorious criminals like Whitey Bulger, who we found out, or he found out late into his life in prison, that he had volunteered for medical experiments in prison in the 50s, and he later found out that they were MK Ultra brainwashing experiments.
Ted Kaczynski.
The
the Unabomber voluntarily went into an MK Ultra experiment at Harvard, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so we have this crazy CIA mind control history that, you know, was not super well known. Do you want to just set the table and give some basics on what happened? The Manson murders, obviously they're extremely famous, but, you know,
and you wouldn't think these
know.
2 subjects would approach, merge, blend together. The history of my investigation of all this was, like Jesse said, I got a magazine assignment in 99 that was going to commemorate what was then going to be the 30th anniversary of the Tate LaBianca murders. So on August 8th, 1969, Sharon Tate, the 8-month pregnant wife of director Roman Polanski, and 2 of her house guests, Wojciech Frykowski, a Polish cameraman who was friends with Roman, Abigail Folger, a well-known coffee heiress from the Folger family, Jay Sebring, the celebrity hairstylist in Hollywood, were all in the house. And there was a home invasion. Nobody knew who did it, but they slaughtered all of them, plus a visitor to the caretaker's house in the back, a 19-year-old kid named Steve Parent. 3 months later, they captured a group of hippies who lived communally, first at the Spahn Ranch, which is outside Los Angeles, in a place called Chatsworth, broken down horse ranch, and then they had migrated out to Death Valley. The early reports were that it was a cult, and their leader was a man named Charles Manson, 32-year-old ex-con, short, like 5'5" or 5'4", and he had 10 or 15 wives, kids. They didn't know who were the parents of which kids. Everyone were raised communally, and in what became then the first sensational trial in Los Angeles, really. Until OJ, there'd never been that kind of attention. They tried them and convicted them. And what the mystery was, why were these people killed in this house? What was the connection of these hippies? What were they looking for? It wasn't a robbery. What the prosecutor, Vince Bugliosi, learned through his investigation was, and this is the official narrative of the story, was that Manson believed that there was an impending race war, which he called Helter Skelter after the Beatles song, and it was taking too long, and he wanted to trigger it. So he ordered his followers to go to this house where he had a relationship with a music producer who had lived there previously, but no longer lived there, named Terry Melcher. And the murders were committed to shock the world. And they left signs that they hoped were going to implicate the Black Panthers and turn the world against the blacks. And then Manson had prophesized, and the prophecies came from Beatles lyrics, Beatles songs that he thought were written to communicate these orders to him. And then the Old Testament, the Book of Revelations, it's just this whole mismatch. Anyway, the murders happened. All of a sudden, these hippies were brought back to Los Angeles from Death Valley. The ones who weren't arrested and charged held vigil outside the courthouse every day for a year. And whatever Manson did in court, the women who were tried beside him, 3 women and then another man separately, Tex Watson, would mimic. So he'd carve X in his forehead, show up at court. The next day, the women defendants would have X's, and everybody outside, the family who were sitting in circles and singing and praying, all had X's in their foreheads. I got assigned this story, and I didn't know what the angle was. This had been written to death. It had, the book that the prosecutor wrote, Helter Skelter, to this day is the best-selling true crime book of all time. I didn't want to do it. I needed a job, though. It was supposed to be 3 months. I began it, and I was trying to find an angle, which can be fun, but it can also be scary because you don't want to write a boring story. And the angle that I kind of settled on was, how did Manson get these young women in under a year to go out and kill complete strangers for no other reason than he told them to, and to have no remorse and to actually laugh about it? And that was something that I think that's why people became so obsessed with the case, and people still make movies about it and write books about it. Not because it was a horrific murder. There's those kinds of murders all the time. And not even because it was a famous actress married to a famous director who was out of the country when it happened, I should say. But because nobody had ever seen anything like this before, where young kids just killed for the joy of killing and then laughed about it afterward. So I began to try to find out what Manson had done, how he had learned, where he had gained this knowledge to get these kids to do this in under 2 years for the majority of them, under a year for about a half dozen of them. And that's what led me to this program, MK Ultra, which I didn't know would be connected to them, but I ended up finding out that there was a psychiatrist named Louis J. West, Jolly West, who was working out of the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic in 1967, where Manson had begun this group, the cult, and he was doing his research there with LSD on hippies. And when the MK Ultra program got exposed, he was alleged to have been part of it, and he told the New York Times he had nothing to do with it. They'd approached him. He wouldn't use LSD on humans, and he said he didn't want to do it. He had died right after I got the assignment. I got access to his papers at UCLA, and after months and months and months of really tedious digging, I was looking for a needle in a haystack, and I found it. He was writing using an alias for Sidney Gottlieb, the head of the program at the CIA. He was called the poisoner in chief, about all the experiments he was going to do, and all of this stuff paralleled his arrival in San Francisco, Manson's arrival in San Francisco. The two of theirs traveled down to Los Angeles, and it was during that period that Manson turned into exactly what the CIA had been trying to create for 15 years at that point. So I present in the book a case that I haven't proven it, absolutely, but I make a case that these two men intersected and Manson was experimented with, the girls were.
You say there's no smoking evidence,
Yeah.
no smoking gun, rather. But you have this kind of, Manson pre-1967 Haight-Ashbury, who is this petty criminal. He's like 5'5" or something. He's not particularly charismatic, and he keeps getting caught for these petty crimes. And he goes into this parole officer, Roger Smith.
Roger Smith,
And
yeah.
Roger Smith specializes in amphetamines and LSD and their effect.
He's a parole officer who's also a criminology student at Berkeley and a drug researcher. And his special field of research was adolescent kids who join gangs and become violent while using drugs.
So he's going into this guy constantly who specializes in this stuff. And then David Smith as well, right?
Yeah,
Ran the
founder of the
Haight-Ashbury
clinic, yeah.
Free Medical Clinic. And we know now from the Church Commission that they had this thing called Operation Midnight Climax, where they would bring in people like Manson and they would sort of dose them up. You have this weird confluence of people around Manson, and then you have this kind of line in the sand of Manson as this like not super charismatic petty criminal into this sex god cult leader guru guy. And it's all in the span of basically a year.
Yeah.
And so, I think that's fairly compelling. And then Jolly West himself, just to you guys have a sense of how pervasive MK Ultra was the head of the UCLA psychiatry. Plenty of reputable psychiatrists, psychologists studied under him, and so it's pretty.
Yeah, if you go to
fascinating.
UCLA, there's an auditorium named after him. He was also the head of the neuroscience center there. He started the first neuroscience center at University of Oklahoma in the 50s after he left the Lackland Air Force Base, which is where he began his first experiments on prisoners at the base, and then went through Oklahoma, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and had connections. He was kind of like a Zelig. When Jack Ruby was arrested and charged for shooting Oswald, he became Ruby's psychiatrist. Not right away. He tried to get on the case right away, but the judge wouldn't let him. He actually requested to be on. The defense attorney wasn't sure what was going on. So Ruby got convicted at trial within a year of the Oswald shooting, never testified, only told the media he had a story to tell. He wanted to tell it. Well, he was getting a second trial, and at the same time, they were finally going to take his testimony, the Warren Commission. All of a sudden, West got assigned to the case, goes in and spends about an hour alone with Ruby at the county jail, and comes out and holds a press conference and says within the preceding 48 hours, Jack Ruby has had a psychotic break from which he'll never recover. He has auditory and visual hallucinations. He thinks there's people in the room. He hears what he says are the cries of Jewish children being boiled alive outside his jail cell at night. From that day forward, Ruby only lived 3 more years. He could never string 3 coherent sentences together. Now, West's specialty, among his specialties, was inducing insanity in a person without their knowledge. And the Warren Commission was never told that this guy was actually hit a conflict of interest. He was working for the CIA at the time. And, are these coincidences, or is there something more to it?
That doesn't sound like a coincidence to me. So you have, just to rehash it for everybody, you have Lee Harvey Oswald, who supposedly was this lone gunman who, took out JFK. That was the kind of conventional narrative. You have Jack Ruby killing him. And by the way, when Jack Ruby shot him, he goes, "What are you doing?" "I'm Jack Ruby," to the cops who were arresting him, almost as if he didn't recall having killed Lee Harvey Oswald.
Well, he didn't. His original defense was he wasn't sure why he was there. His lawyer said he had an epileptic fit, and he had no memory of this.
And then he's seen by Jolly West in a jail cell with no cameras present and goes nuts right afterwards. So I think that's a pretty interesting fact pattern. But going back to Manson, other possible pieces of evidence that he was an MK Ultra patient. His whole life was kind of modeled off of this sci-fi novel, Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert Heinlein, this 1968 bestseller. And he called his son was like Don Valentine, right? And
Michael Valentine.
Michael Valentine,
his
sorry.
firstborn child.
And then Roger Smith, his parole officer, was Jubal, this protector character.
Yeah, so if you're not familiar with the novel, in the 1960s, everyone read that book, especially hippies.
And so, but Manson was supposedly illiterate. So it brings up this like really interesting question. Was he like dosed up with LSD, read this thing that then became like the narrative for his life? Because in it, it involves this race war or whatever, like a lot of this stuff that he was talking about in his life.
And it's about a leader who is born on Mars, dispatched to the Earth to start a new society of offspring. And he has communal wives, and he has someone who protects him in the legal system who is called Jubal. And Roger's nickname from Manson and the girls was Jubal. There's a lot of spooky figures that kind of were on the periphery of Manson's life for the 2 years he was free between 67 and his arrest in 69. There's like a half dozen of them, and it's kind of a real cornucopia of characters that I present in the book that were really hard to find, to get information on. A lot of them have no records. I did CIA FOIA requests for the 2 or 3 that I was sure were affiliated with the CIA, and you got what's called the GLOMA response. We can neither confirm nor deny any relationship with the CIA, which means, yeah, they were in the CIA. And these people kind of traveled and followed Manson, and when Bugliosi came in and did his prosecution, he erased them from the story. He removed any trace of them having anything to do with the group. It's a really crazy, wild story.
Crazy. So you have, you have a lot of compelling evidence that you write about that Manson was almost being tracked by authorities before he killed Tate. Spahn Ranch was actually raided and bugged. So it was like they could hear like Manson sort of plotting out the murder. And Reeve Whitson, this mysterious guy who would tell everybody, his friends and family, that he was CIA, knew about
no, he
the
wouldn't
murder?
actually say that.
Okay.
He would say he worked for the government, but he couldn't say who he worked for.
Okay.
And it wasn't until a year or 2 before he died, he told about 3 or 4 or 5 people who were very close to him, his daughter, his lawyer, who told me reluctantly that he had said to them that he was working in an undercover operation where he had infiltrated the Manson family for this government agency, and his dying regret was he could have prevented the murders from happening. And he said, I was there at the crime scene the night of the murders. He said, I wasn't there when they occurred. I came after and saw the aftermath and left before the police came. And there's actually sound evidence and other physical evidence that shows there was somebody at the property. Manson did go back, and he's never said who he went back with. So, yeah, you're dealing with a lot of kind of shady, crazy shit.
To say the least.
Yeah, but it all kind of falls into place.
We have a lot of evidence that maybe the government had, knew more about this stuff, and maybe Manson was some sort of construct. The question is like motive, like why would you kill a beautiful pregnant movie star in the form of Sharon Tate, who America loved?
He's knocking on the chaos door and the COINTELPRO door.
Exactly.
So the CIA had another operation called Operation Chaos, which began in 1967 in San Francisco, and it was set up to do what the FBI also had a program doing called COINTELPRO, and it was all investigated. The agencies admitted they did it. COINTELPRO and Chaos were designed to neutralize the left-wing movement and the black militant movement in the United States in 67. So by 67, the Panthers were becoming really powerful, the Black Panthers. The anti-war movement was real. The war was escalating. People didn't trust the President Johnson. And Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, believed that the biggest threat to the United States at that time was internal, that the youth was going to overthrow the country and take over, and they needed to do something to stop it. So Chaos was started and COINTELPRO was started, and they would get agents to infiltrate the groups and then do, among other things, get them to provoke the groups to commit crimes that they could actually get shot and killed by agents waiting in the course of the crimes, like a bank robbery or gun theft, stealing guns. Also, they were trying to provoke them to kill one another, particularly the Black Panthers, who were splintering a lot. There was a lot of rivalries among different Panther groups in different cities, and there were other Black militant groups. In Los Angeles, there was something called the U.S. Slaves. There were 2 Black U.S. slaves killed at UCLA campus in 68, which the FBI admitted when another whistleblower came out in the 70s that those 2 murders had been pretty much orchestrated by FBI agents on the orders of the people in Washington. About 6-7 months before the Sharon Tate murders, which, if you don't know, it was a horrible, horrible murder. I mean, it's bad enough that she was 8.5 months pregnant, but the 4 victims that were stabbed more than 200 times. There was blood writing on the wall. It was a real horrific crime scene. And the Tate House kind of represented liberal Hollywood. It was a party house. the white celebrities in LA were starting to support the Panthers financially. They were doing fundraisers. They actually had a group, I forget what the name was now, not called the White Panthers, but it was Friends of the Panthers. And famously, Jane Fonda, Gene Seberg, Warren Beatty, Marlon Brando, Donald Sutherland, they were having meetings. Hoover wrote a memo to the head of the LA field office in November of '68 saying what we have to get these white supporters of the Panthers to fear is that when the revolution finally happens, they're going to be lined up against the wall and slaughtered with the rest of the white population. And then that August, 5 white people were slaughtered in a house. It really was probably the embodiment of the left-wing Hollywood establishment.
Manson himself, he was an aspiring musician, right? There's actually on YouTube, there's one of his songs, I think it's like "Look at Your Game, Girl."
Yeah,
is that right?
yeah,
It's like got over 2 million views, and it's like eerily like not that bad.
Neil Young.
He was also living with Dennis Wilson, right? One of the Beach Boys, and.
There's a lot of different chapters to the story. Manson infiltrated the rock and roll world in 1968 through the drummer for the Beach Boys, Dennis Wilson, who became mesmerized by him, allowed the girls and Manson to live in his house in the Pacific Palisades for about 2 months until they trashed the house, trashed his rolls, gave him VD, stole his money, and he threw them all out.
And so the overall point is, if you're trying to co-opt counterculture, what do? You have this construct of a guy that like looks like and acts like a hippie, a kind of a counterculture revolutionary type, and you make him do some really bad, savage stuff. And you have Donna Tartt, famous author, writing August 8th, 1969. That was the day the 60s ended. Like the hippie movement was sort of torn apart by this. And there's also speculation that I think MK Ultra occurred in Laurel Canyon as well, and so you have the like quotes at the time. Abby Hoffman, who's this famous hippie, who's like, we were just upright Berkeley students doing our normal kind of hippie thing and protesting very peacefully, and you had these flower children from Laurel Canyon with their guns and their drugs and they're trying to kill each other or whatever, and it kind of marginalized the whole movement.
It's funny because a lot of those guys, the yippies, Hoffman and them, were paranoid and did think that they had been infiltrated by people who were trying to set them up. And what happened with the Manson case was within a week of his arrest, there's on the cover of every newspaper in the world, a magazine, and it was confusing because the women are 17, 18, 19, they're wearing love beads, they have long hair, they've got babies, breastfeeding, and they look like the hippies you saw, on Life magazine, but these women are accused of being murderers, savage murderers, and they're kind of playing into it to the reporters, and overnight people became terrified of hippies. They wouldn't pick them up hitchhiking anymore. It really, if the Chaos and COINTELPRO's goal was to make society fear the left wing and fear what was happening, they accomplished it with that act, those murders.
What do you think Manson was taught? Because even until the end, like I think he had this interview with Charlie Rose, right? And he was like, there's like a reality warp, like there's this weird effect that he has, and he was dating a beautiful, I think, woman in her mid-20s, like at the end of his life while he's in prison. So
Star.
he is able to have some like magnetic, weird, culty pull on the outside world while he's in prison.
So Star was a woman who came from Ohio, just like a million women before her, but when Manson was free, she was drawn to him. She was beautiful, and she became his girlfriend. She lived outside the prison gates. We don't have conjugal visits in the state of California, so she could only go in and hold his hand and sit with him, and she had a relationship with him until he found out that she was also fucking Grey Wolf, who was his guy outside the wall who managed his publicity and everything. So Star ended up drifting away. Charlie, a friend of mine who was very close to Charlie, said it was the only time he ever heard Charlie cry because he was so brokenhearted that Star had cheated on him with his best friend. Star is now either engaged to or married to an actor named Vincent Gallo, who she lives with in Malibu.
Is Buffalo 66?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Crazy.
who was obsessed with Manson, has the largest collection of Manson art, memorabilia, and wanted to play him. There were several movie projects that were being developed. And if you know the guy, you can see why he'd be perfect to play Charlie. And I met him at a party just this past fall and introduced myself. And I asked him if it was true because I'd heard the rumor. And he said, yeah, stars with me.
What's the tip of the spear on your research now?
Jolly West reported to the CIA in 1955 that he had developed the technology to implant false memory in a person and remove true memories using a combination of drugs and hypnosis without that person's knowledge, and it would be permanent. And that was in 1955. So that's like 5, 6, 7 years into the program. It went another 10 or 12 years. When they had the congressional hearings, the CIA said they were going to turn over all the documents they had, which weren't a lot because they destroyed most of the things. Well, they summarized West's report, and I had West's original report. It's one of the documents I found at UCLA. And in the original report, he makes that pronouncement to them that he has successfully done really the most important thing that they needed to do. When the document that ended up at Congress and is in the record, that paragraph is missing. They took that out. They censored it. They didn't redact it. They just acted like it never existed. They redrafted his document. I think that they'd be idiots not to still use it. I have no evidence. I don't report on anything after like the 70s because I'm doing a second book, a follow-up, and I'm still just trying to stick to the 1940s through about 75, and I'm looking real hard at Manson's life in prison before he was released. He was in federal institutions from the time he was 12 or 13, and in the institutions he was in, starting out on the East Coast, in Ohio and Pennsylvania, Washington, D.C., National Boys School. There was MK Ultra research going on at all those places that he was at, and they were looking for adolescent boys who were prone to crime and prone to violence, who had no families, no network of support outside that would be concerned about what happened to them. And that was Charlie. That's who he was.
Should we open it up to Q&A?
Sure.
Okay.
If anybody has a question.
You mentioned that MK Ultra may have had an objective of subverting sort of hippie culture and making it seem like a threat. Does that assume a level of competence of government entities that is realistic?
You know, they took the fall for it. They look like fools. But that was what the sacrifice they had to make to keep it going and to protect what they had.
Hi. Could you speak a little bit about the alleged connection between the Grateful Dead, the CIA, and MK Ultra? Because that's fascinating to me.
Yeah. So the Dead were early distributors of LSD, free LSD, in the heyday at their concerts in Golden Gate Park, and Osley Stanley was the one who was the chemist who was making it. I haven't looked a lot into that since my book came out. You know, I get lots and lots of people contacting me with information, and I've kept a file on the people who have the Osley Stanley was a CIA agent, and the Dead knew what he was doing and why he was doing it, but I don't have any real personal original reporting on that. It's just stuff I'm starting to collect now.
Okay, awesome, guys. Thank you so much.
Thanks very
Really
much
appreciate it.
for indulging us. Yeah.